the 1790s, Alexander Hamilton, who brilliantly unified the pro-Constitution Federalists of 1788 and then headed the new government's Treasury Department, had become the country's most polarizing figure. Hamilton grew up on a small Caribbean island. His parents were not married, his father abandoned the family when he was young, and his mother died when he was 11. His childhood struggles would stoke the fires of a ferocious ambition. After serving an apprenticeship, the bright lad made his way to New York City, where he gained entry to King's College, now Columbia University. During the American Revolution, he wrote political articles that caught the eye of General George Washington, who selected the 19-year-old to be his aide. The two became close. In the 1780s, Hamilton practiced law in New York and participated in the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. With his political savvy, he served a critical role in the ratification process. Handsome and now well-connected, he married into one of New York's wealthiest and most powerful families. His magnetic charm attracted both men and women. At social gatherings, he shone. Late-night rivalry, however, never interfered with Hamilton's prodigious capacity for work. As Washington's first Treasury Secretary, Hamilton took bold action. A government, confident of its own powers, he remarked, is the surest way to inspire the same confidence in others. He immediately tackled the country's Revolutionary War debt, producing a complex plan to fund the debt and pump millions of dollars into the economy. He instituted a national banking system to manage the money supply, and he proposed a system of government subsidies and tariffs to promote manufacturing. Hamilton was a gifted man with remarkable political instincts. He was also good at making enemies. The founding fathers who had allied in the 1770s and 1780s to fight a revolution and write a constitution became bitter rivals in the 1790s as deep ideological fissures pulled the nation apart. James Madison, now a representative in Congress, led the opposition to Hamilton's economic program. John Adams, Washington's vice president, privately called Hamilton the bastard brat of a Scotch peddler, driven by disappointed ambition and unbridled malice and revenge. Years later, when asked why he had deserted Hamilton, Madison coolly replied, "Colonel Hamilton deserted me." Hamilton and his allies assumed that government was most stable when in the hands of the rich, the wise, and the good, by which he meant America's commercial elite. By contrast, Jefferson, Madison, and their supporters clung to agrarian values and looked suspiciously on finance and manufacturing. The turbulent international events of the period, including the French and Haitian revolutions and the explosion of extraordinarily destructive warfare throughout Europe and its colonies, dramatically inflamed American divisions. The political antagonisms of these first years left their mark on the young country. No one predicted the intense polarization over economic and foreign policy. By 1800, the two opposing camps had crystallized into political parties, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. At their heart, these disagreements reflected opposing ideas about the meaning of republicanism, the limits of federal power, and the nation's role on the global stage. To most Americans of that day, this was an unhappy development, one the Constitution had not foreseen. After the turbulence of the 1780s, the new government's most urgent task was to establish stability and heal the lingering divisions between Federalists and Anti-Federalists. The election of George Washington as president offered a good start. People trusted him with the presidency's expansive powers. Congress had important work as well in fleshing out the new government and amending the Constitution. It quickly agreed on the Bill of Rights, which answered the concerns of many Anti-Federalists. Beyond politics, changing meanings of gender enhanced political stability. The private virtue of women was mobilized to bolster the public virtue of male citizens. Republicanism forced a rethinking of women's relation to the state. George Washington was elected president in February 1789 by a unanimous vote of the Electoral College. John Adams, with half as many votes, became vice president. Washington embodied the Republican ideal of disinterested, public-spirited leadership. He cultivated that image through dramatic ceremonies like the surrender of his sword to the Continental Congress at the Revolution's end, enacting the subservience of military power to the law and instilling faith among Americans in his commitment to Republican government. Washington's inauguration and formation of his first cabinet was celebrated with a lavish ball in New York City, then the temporary capital of the United States. Thomas Jefferson, just arrived from a France that had begun to liberate itself from the Bourbon monarchy, was offended by the sight of Americans dressed in the height of 18th century fashions, dancing minuets played by a chamber orchestra, and all approaching a raised dais upon which sat George and Martha Washington in large, elaborately carved chairs upholstered in silk and painted with gold leaf, to bow and curtsy. It offended his radical Republican and egalitarian sensibilities. To Jefferson, who attended the ball in a simple brown suit, it looked an awful lot like monarchism, and little that followed did much to assuage his fears that the United States was starting down the wrong path. Once in office, Washington acted cautiously, aware that every step set a precedent and any misstep could endanger the fragile government. Congress debated a title for Washington, ranging from His Highness to His Majesty the President. Washington favored His High Mightiness. In the end, Republican simplicity prevailed. President of the United States of America became the executive's title, and the established form of address became Mr. President, a restrained yet dignified title. Washington's success in launching the presidency lay in his ability to extend his personal reputation to the public office. In the political language of the day, he was virtuous, meaning that he put the public good over his private interest and personal ambition. Most Americans were confident he would resist taking power for himself. Despite his genuine commitment to Republican values, he occasionally indulged in ostentation to endow the office with respect, traveling with 6 horses to pull his coach and surrounding himself with uniformed servants. He held weekly levees, as European monarchs did, hour-long audiences granted to distinguished visitors, male and female, at which he appeared attired in black velvet with a feathered hat and a polished sword. The president and his guests bowed, avoiding the egalitarian familiarity of a handshake. Ultimately, he succeeded in endowing the office with respect while avoiding the royal splendor of a monarch. Washington chose talented men to lead the newly created Departments of War, State, and the Treasury. For the Department of War, Washington selected General Henry Knox, former Secretary of War in the Confederation government. For the Treasury, an especially tough job in view of the revenue crisis that sparked the drafting of the Constitution, the President appointed Alexander Hamilton. To lead the State Department, which ran foreign policy, Washington chose Thomas Jefferson, who had served as minister to France in the 1780s. For Attorney General, Washington picked Edmund Randolph, a Virginian who had attended the Constitutional Convention but had turned anti-Federalist during ratification. For Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Washington appointed John Jay, a New York lawyer who had helped write the Federalist Papers. Soon, Washington began holding regular meetings with these men, establishing the precedent of a presidential candidate. Vice President John Adams was not included. His only official duty, to preside over the Senate, he found a punishment. To his wife he complained, "My country has, in its wisdom, contrived for me the most insignificant office." No one anticipated the party turbulence that would soon divide this brilliant group into rival camps. The first Congress began meeting in 1789. Its most pressing business was to pass a Bill of Rights. 7 states had ratified the Constitution with the demand of amendments to specify protected individual rights and limitations on federal power. The framers of the Constitution had thought such a list unnecessary. After the divisions of the ratification controversy, however, it seemed likely to promote national unity and to extinguish from the bosom of every member of the community, as Congressman James Madison put it, any apprehensions that there are among his countrymen who wish to deprive them of the liberty for which they valiantly fought and honorably bled. Madison initially suggested that the Constitution be rewritten to place the material in the first proposed amendments in the relevant articles rather than as a sort of addendum or as amendments, concerned that launching the Constitution with pre-existing amendments would signal a lack of unity or political uncertainty. This was rejected because that would mean that citizens would have to read the entire Constitution and glean their rights from its lofty language, and this might leave too much open to interpretation. He then offered to include them at the end as a series of new articles, but Anti-Federalists insisted that the Bill of Rights be a set of amendments because that would make it easier to amend the Constitution in the future, fearful that no branch of government would want to be the first to propose that the Constitution be amended, and that this would prevent it from ever being amended. Drawing on existing state constitutions, the proposed amendments enumerated rights to freedom of speech, press, and religion, the right to petition and assemble, and the right to freedom from unwarranted searches and seizures. One amendment guaranteed the right to keep and bear arms in support of a well-regulated militia, to which Madison added, "But no person religiously scrupulous of bearing arms shall be compelled to render military service in person." That provision for what a later century would call conscientious objector status failed to gain acceptance in Congress. In September 1789, Congress approved a set of 12 amendments and sent them to the states for approval. By 1791, 10 were ratified. The first through 8th dealt with individual liberties, and the 9th and 10th addressed the boundary between federal and state authority. Not everyone was satisfied. State ratifying conventions had submitted some 80 proposed amendments. Congress never considered proposals to change structural features of the new government. It had no appetite to reopen debates about the length of the president's term, for example, or the power to levy excise taxes. Although the Bill of Rights ignored the status of enslaved people, some activists capitalized on the First Amendment's right to petition to force the first Congress to debate the issue. Significantly, no one pointed to a striking omission in the Bill of Rights: the right to vote. Voting was seen as a fundamental right only decades later. The Constitution left the definition of eligible voters to the states because of the wide variation in local voting practices. Most of these were based on property qualifications, although some touched on religion. The exclusion of women from formal politics did not eliminate them from all civic roles. To the contrary, a growing chorus of voices argued that American women had special obligations. A republic, it was believed, required virtuous citizens to survive. Who would foster that virtue? According to more and more people, that task fell to women. "The solidity and stability of the liberties of your country rest with you, since liberty is never sure till virtue reigns triumphant," wrote one author to female audiences. "While you thus keep our country virtuous, you maintain its independence." Until the late 18th century, public virtue was strictly a masculine quality, the prerogative of the male, landowning, independent head of the household. But another kind of virtue now grew in importance: feminine sexual chastity. Essayists of the 1790s explicitly advised young women to use their private sexual virtue to increase public virtue in men. "Love and courtship invest a lady with more authority than in any other situation that falls to the lot of human beings," one essayist proclaimed. Republican ideals also cast motherhood in a new light. Throughout the 1790s, advocates for female education argued that educated women would make better mothers, who would in turn produce better male citizens. Historians call this the concept of Republican motherhood. Benjamin Rush, a Pennsylvania physician and educator, called for female education because our ladies should be qualified in instructing their sons in the principles of liberty and in government. Massachusetts writer Judith Sargent Murray favored education that would remake women into self-confident, rational beings. She boldly titled her first essay, published in 1790, on the equality of the sexes. In a subsequent essay on education, however, she reassured readers that educated women would retain their characteristic trait of sweetness, thus reaffirming older stereotypes of women as compliant. Although women's obligations as wives and mothers carried new political meanings, they did not amount to a revolution in gender relations. The analogy between motherhood and Republican government succeeded because the term virtue implied that both men and women should subordinate their private interests. Men should put the public good first, just as women must put their husbands and families first. Women might gain literacy and knowledge, but the objective was to create better male citizens. Nor did ideas of Republican motherhood extend to black women. That they might also have the capacity for virtue eluded most writing at the time. In Federalist America, wives and citizens should feel affection for and trust in their rulers, but neither should ever rebel. Compared to the instability of the 1780s, the 1790s brimmed with opportunity. Trade, transportation, and banking sectors all boomed. In 1790, the nation's capital moved to Philadelphia, the nation's largest city, where Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton launched his ambitious plans to strengthen government finances. His proposals to fund the national debt, set up a national bank, promote manufacturing, and raise revenue with a whiskey tax met with intense political opposition. A sharp rise in international grain prices in the 1790s drove American farmers to increase agricultural production and exports. From the Connecticut River Valley to the Chesapeake, wheat production generated profits for farmers and new jobs for millers, coopers, dock workers, and shipbuilders. Cotton production also boomed, spurred by demand from British textile manufacturers and a new mechanical invention. For nearly a century, planters had grown long staple cotton with slave labor in coastal areas of the South, but this variety of cotton did not prosper in the continent's vast inland regions. Short staple cotton grew well inland, but its rough seeds stuck to the cotton fibers and took hours of labor to remove. In 1793, Yale graduate Eli Whitney devised a machine called a gin that separated out the seeds. Suddenly, just as American Indians were losing their vast territories to American settlers, short staple cotton could be profitably grown. Production soared, contributing to the growing transatlantic trade with Britain, whose factories produced the raw cotton into cloth. A surge of road building further stimulated the economy. Before 1790, one road connected Maine to Georgia. With the establishment of the U.S. Post Office in 1792, road mileage increased sixfold. Private companies also built toll roads, such as the Lancaster Turnpike west of Philadelphia, the Boston to Albany Turnpike, and a road from Virginia to Tennessee. By 1800, a network of dirt, gravel, and plank roadways connected towns in southern New England and the Middle Atlantic states, expanding the number of commercial stage companies and reducing travel times between major cities. During the 1790s, commercial banking grew dramatically. The number of banks nationwide multiplied tenfold, from 3 to 29. Banks drew in money chiefly through the sale of stock. They then made loans in the form of banknotes, paper currency backed by gold and silver from stock sales. By issuing 2 or 3 times as much money in banknotes as they held in hard money, they expanded the money supply and helped spur the economy. By issuing 2 or 3 times as much money in banknotes as they held in hard money, they expanded the money supply and helped spur the economy. The U.S. population expanded along with the economic development. As measured by the first 2 federal censuses in 1790 and 1800, the population grew from 3.9 million to 5.3 million, an extraordinary increase of 35%. Looking at the 1790 census data, the total population for each state is given first, while in parentheses the African American population is noted, followed by the percentage of the black population that was enslaved. As can readily be seen, the total populations of the North and South were roughly equal except for the African American component, where Southern blacks greatly outnumbered their Northern counterparts. Note also that the numbers of free African Americans was much higher than in the South. The upturn in the economy, along with the government's new taxation powers, meant that the United States might soon pay off its wartime debt. But Hamilton had a different objective. He wanted to make the new country creditworthy rather than debt-free. His 1790 Report on Public Credit recommended that the debt be funded but not repaid immediately. Old certificates of debt would be converted into new bonds, which would earn interest for several years before being fully paid off. In the meantime, the bonds would circulate, injecting millions of dollars of new money into the economy. Equally important, from Hamilton's perspective, holders of the country's bonds would develop a direct financial stake in the government's success. A national debt, if not excessive, will be to us a national blessing, he wrote. It will be a powerful cement of our union. Hamilton's thinking about debt had a lot to do with his cynical opinion about fundamental human nature and suspicion of the vast majority of Americans in particular. He believed that one must strive to survive through hard work, but that the individual must have harsh incentives to do hard work, and that those who did not have to work to have all of the necessities of life would not be inclined to do any work for those necessities. They might work to attain wealth and luxury, but he thought that most would rather find other routes to riches that did not involve much or any effort. Poverty was not usually a condition befalling someone through bad fortune, but was in his estimation the product of inherent human laziness. This was a widely shared sentiment in the 18th century, but most intellectuals believed that debt was a condition stoutly to be avoided when at all possible. They subscribed to William Shakespeare's dictum, "Neither a borrower nor a lender be." To be in debt was to put yourself in a subordinate position to another, who would hold power over you, which did not square with notions of republican virtue to which the revolutionaries adhered. To Hamilton, however, debt provided a necessary motivation for the individual to get up early every morning and spend every waking moment in hard work to pay down and pay off their debts. Otherwise, they might prefer to work just enough to have the things they need and waste the rest of their time and energy on other things that did not lead to self-improvement. What was true of the individual, Hamilton thought, was even more true of nations, and so he advocated strongly for a national debt to stimulate the American economy. Funding the debt in full was controversial because speculators had bought most debt certificates at a sharp discount when it appeared that they would never be repaid. Hamilton compounded the controversy with his proposal that the federal government take on another $25 million of state debt. During the war, states had obtained supplies by issuing IOUs to farmers, merchants, and moneylenders. Some states, such as Virginia and New York, had paid these debts off entirely. Others, such as Massachusetts, had partially paid them off through heavy taxation of the people. About half the states had made little headway. Hamilton called for the federal government to assume these state debts and combine them with the federal debt. Congressman James Madison strenuously objected to a plan that provided windfall profits to wealthy speculators, while the soldiers and farmers who had earned the debt certificates by their struggles and sacrifice received a fraction of the money they were promised. He instead proposed a complex scheme to pay both the original holders of the federal debt and the speculators, each in fair proportion. Madison also objected to assumption of the states' debts. First, he thought the plan unfair to those states that had struggled to pay off their debt. Furthermore, he believed a large debt was dangerous because it would inevitably lead to high taxation. Jefferson shared Madison's concerns in a letter to the president. "This exactly marks the difference between Colonel Hamilton's views and mine," he wrote, "that I would wish the debt paid tomorrow. He wishes it never to be paid, but always to be a thing wherewith to corrupt and manage the legislature." To resolve the impasse, Jefferson invited Hamilton and Madison to dinner. Over good food and wine, Madison pledged his support for Hamilton's plan. In return, Hamilton agreed to endorse the relocation of the nation's capital city to the south along the Potomac River, an outcome sure to please Virginians. In early July 1790, Congress voted for the Potomac site, and in late July, Congress passed the debt package, assumption and all. The second and third elements of Hamilton's economic plan recommended a national bank of the United States and support for domestic manufacturing. Arguing that banks were nurseries of national wealth, Hamilton modeled his proposed bank on the Bank of England, which he believed had advanced Britain's economic and military power in the 18th century. According to Hamilton's plan, the central bank would be capitalized at $10 million, a sum larger than all the hard money in the entire nation. The federal government would hold 20% of the bank's stock. The bank would receive and administer government revenues from import duties, land sales, and various other taxes. Private investors would subscribe to the other 80% of the bank's capital, buying stock with either hard money, silver or gold, or the recently issued federal securities. Because of its size and its status as a national bank, the Bank of the United States would help stabilize the economy by exerting prudent control over credit, interest rates, and inflation. Concerned that a few rich bankers might gain excessive influence over the economy, Madison tried to block the plan in Congress. Jefferson advised President Washington that the Constitution did not permit Congress to charter banks. Hamilton countered that Congress possessed explicit powers to regulate commerce and a broad mandate to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. Washington sided with Hamilton and signed the Bank of the United States into law in February 1791, giving it a 20-year charter. When the bank stock went on sale a few months later, it sold out in a few hours. Calling the spectacle a mere scramble for so much public plunder, a discouraged Madison reported that in New York, the coffee house is in an eternal buzz with the gamblers. The intense speculation pained Jefferson too. The spirit of gaming, when once it has seized a subject, is incurable. The tailor who has made thousands in one day, though he has lost them the next, can never again be content with the slow and moderate earnings of his needle. Hamilton proposed the final element of his economic plan in his December 1791 report on manufactures. With the production of American-made goods in its infancy, Hamilton hoped to support domestic manufacturers by imposing moderate tariffs on imports. His plan targeted iron goods, arms and ammunition, coal, textiles, wood products, and glass. Among the benefits of manufacturing, he included the new employment opportunities that would open to children and unmarried young women who he believed were underutilized in agricultural societies. Hamilton's report on manufactures went a step too far, however. Congress never approved or even voted on the plan. Many agriculturalists in Congress believed that industry was a curse rather than a blessing. They wanted a nation of landowning farmers, not wage-working laborers. Madison and Jefferson also objected to stretching the general welfare clause of the Constitution to include public subsidies to private businesses. Conflicts over economic policy were not the only threats to the nation's stability. Other pressures originated on the country's western periphery, where discontented settlers threatened rebellion against the federal government. Meanwhile, American Indian nations continued to battle U.S. sovereignty in the region between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River. To the southwest, the Washington administration engaged principally in diplomatic negotiations to extend U.S. sovereignty. To the northwest, however, the Army waged a bitter war to conquer American Indian territory. For more than a century, settlers along the western edge of colonial settlement had distrusted centralized authority. Their resentment had periodically boiled over, in Bacon's Rebellion in the 17th century, in resistance to the Royal Proclamation of 1763, and in Shays' Rebellion in 1787. In regions west of the Appalachian Mountains, resentment continued to seethe, in part for geographic reasons, in part in response to feelings of federal neglect. Tensions between eastern and western regions threatened the stability of the United States in the 1790s. For land-hungry settlers, victory in the American Revolution signaled an invitation to occupy the West. Kentucky was the first front. With an insignificant settler presence in 1780, the region's white population exploded, from under 74,000 in 1790 to over 220,000 in 1800. As settlers pushed into Indian territories, they unleashed a fierce resistance among American Indian nations dedicated to protecting their lands. Exhausted from the Revolution, the Army could barely muster a defense against native attacks. The federal government's inability to protect them from Indian assault angered many settlers. Even worse, from their perspective, federal power chased squatters off public lands as often as it protected them from attacks. In the mid-1790s, anger toward the federal government boiled over, this time in response to Hamilton's tax policies. His economic plan required revenue to pay the interest on the large national debt. In deference to the Eastern merchants, Hamilton did not propose an increase in import duties, nor did he propose land taxes, which would have fallen hardest on the nation's wealthy landowners in the East. Instead, he convinced Congress in 1791 to pass a 25% tax on whiskey, which fell disproportionately on Western farmers bringing grain to the distillery. Given the lack of decent roads and the difficulties of transporting large amounts of grain from rural farms to urban markets, many farmers opted to distill their grain into alcohol in order to transport less cargo and get higher prices than they would otherwise get for grain. The decision to tax whiskey was not an arbitrary one, as alcohol consumption at the end of the 18th century was much higher than it is today. Bear in mind, there was no such thing as water treatment facilities, and nobody outside a lucky few living in urban centers had anything like public water systems, so water was rarely safe to drink. Water was used to take care of livestock and irrigate crops, of course, but human consumption of water was limited to boiling it for tea or coffee. Cow's milk was not drunk, but put to better use to make butter, cream, and cheese, as well as curds and whey, as we know from Little Miss Muffet. Raw or filtered fruit juices were never much considered for drinking, they being better used to make wine and hard cider. Consequently, alcohol consumption was roughly 3 times greater in the 1790s than it is today, and people of nearly all ages tippled, even children. So taxing whiskey promised to bring in an enormous revenue for the federal government. The whiskey tax was deeply unpopular. In 1791, farmers in Kentucky and the western parts of Pennsylvania, Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas forcefully expressed their resentment. "If this is not an oppressive tax," wrote one farmer, "I am at a loss to describe what it is." Discontent only grew in the following years, as crowds threatened to tar and feather tax collectors. It finally exploded in western Pennsylvania in July 1794, when a stubborn tax collector named John Neville, along with a federal marshal, served legal documents to several distillers. The Whiskey Rebellion began the next day, when a crowd of 500 burned Neville's house while the marshal fled to Pittsburgh. On August 1st, 7,000 Pennsylvania farmers gathered to protest the tax. A group of them issued a letter calling on citizens of the western country to join the protesters with as many volunteers as you can raise. Echoing the American Revolution, this resistance to an unpopular tax seemed ready to spread across the Ohio Valley from Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia to Kentucky and Ohio, areas where the popular loyalties to the distant central government were thinnest. Recognizing the threat to his new government, President Washington nationalized the Pennsylvania militia. With Hamilton at his side, he rode out at the head of 13,000 soldiers, more than he ever commanded at any one time during the Revolution. A Philadelphia newspaper criticized the massive mobilization. "Shall torrents of blood be spilled to support an odious excise system?" But no blood spilled. The massive show of force quashed the rebellion. By the time Washington and his army arrived in late September, the demonstrators had dispersed and disappeared. No battles were fought and no shots were exchanged. 20 men were charged with high treason, but only 2 were convicted, and Washington pardoned both. Had the federal government overreacted? Thomas Jefferson thought so. The rebel farmers agreed. They felt entitled to protest oppressive taxation. Hamilton and Washington, however, thought that laws passed by a Republican government, as opposed to those of an unrepresentative parliament, demanded strict obedience. For them, the Whiskey Rebellion presented an opportunity for the new federal government to flex its muscles and stand up to civil disorder. If Washington's response to the Whiskey Rebellion muted resentment among Western settlers, at least for the time being, it did nothing to appease the anger of American Indians at the continual encroachment on their lands. Some 20,000 Indians of loosely affiliated Creek villages occupied the territory extending from Georgia into what is now Mississippi. Border skirmishes with land-hungry Georgians were growing in frequency. To help keep American squatters off their lands, Creek leaders cultivated alliances with Spanish authorities in Louisiana. The U.S. government was in a bind. It needed to take charge of Indian affairs without alienating the settlers whose loyalties it needed, and without getting embroiled in a costly war. Washington and his Secretary of War, Henry Knox, singled out the Creek chief Alexander McGillivray to negotiate a treaty. Like others of mixed European and native ancestry, McGillivray played an important role as a broker between cultures and mediator in trade and diplomacy. His French Creek mother conferred a claim to Creek leadership, while his Scottish fur-trading father gave him exposure to British diplomacy. Fluent in English and conversant in Spanish, McGillivray spoke several Creek languages and had even studied Greek and Latin. In the 1770s, he worked for the British distributing gifts to various southern tribes. In the 1780s, he gained renown for brokering negotiations with the Spanish in Florida. Secretary Knox invited McGillivray to New York to meet with the president. McGillivray arrived in a triumphal procession of Creek chiefs and was accorded the honors of a head of state. The delegation was met with the largest crowds since Washington's inauguration. Their negotiations resulted in the 1790 Treaty of New York. The United States guaranteed Creek tribal lands, promising that its federal troops would protect the boundary against land-seeking settlers. U.S. authorities also committed to annual payments to the Creek people in money and trade goods. In return, the Creeks promised to accept the United States as its sole trading partner, shutting Spain out. Both sides had made promises they could not keep. McGillivray believed the best way to advance the Creeks' interests was by fostering competition between American and Spanish officials for Creek alliances and trade. By 1792, he had signed an agreement with the Spanish governor of New Orleans, each side pledging to resist encroachments by Georgia's settlers. As for U.S. authorities, they were in no position to prohibit intrusions into Creek lands. They lacked the military power and the political will to fight their own citizens. Nor did they wish to inflame the anger of settlers in the Southwest and risk another rebellion. By the time Alexander McGillivray died in 1793, the Treaty of New York joined the list of treaties never implemented. In dealing with the Creeks, Washington and Knox had sought a different approach to Indian affairs, one rooted more in British than in American experience. But a Republican government required popular consent, all the more so in border regions where national loyalties were so tenuous. This imperative meant that confrontation with the native population was all but inevitable. Native people between the Ohio River and the Great Lakes were even less willing to negotiate with the new federal government. By the 1790s, Shawnee, Delaware, Miami, and other groups forming the Northwest Confederacy had been fighting to control their lands for nearly half a century, playing European powers off each other in a complex game of trade and diplomacy. They refused to recognize the 1783 Treaty of Paris, in which the British had ceded their lands to the United States without their consent. They continued to fight for their homelands. They were in direct confrontation with U.S. ambitions to settle the region. Guided by the Northwest Ordinance, the federal government started to survey and map eastern Ohio in preparation to sell the land. Fort Washington on the Ohio River at the site of present-day Cincinnati became the command post for three major invasions of Indian country. This American offensive met a determined American Indian resistance, strengthened by support from British forts along the Great Lakes in the Ohio Valley. These forts protected the fur trade between British traders and Indians, supplied weapons to the Northwest Confederacy, and sustained native claims to the land. The first U.S. campaign began in the fall of 1790, when General Josiah Harmar marched with 1,400 men into northwest Ohio, burning Indian villages. Miami and Shawnee Indians, led by their chiefs Little Turtle and Blue Jacket, ambushed Harmar's inexperienced troops and chased them out. Harmar's defeat prompted a second effort. In the fall of 1791, General Arthur St. Clair, military governor of the Northwest Territory, led 2,000 men and 200 female camp followers deep into Indian country, where they constructed two forts. The show of military might did not intimidate native forces, however. They attacked at the headwaters of the Wabash River, leaving 55% of the Americans dead or wounded. Only 3 women escaped alive. With more than 900 lives lost, it was the worst American defeat in the history of Indian wars. After St. Clair's defeat, Washington doubled the U.S. military presence in Ohio and appointed a new commander, General Mad Anthony Wayne of Pennsylvania. About the Ohio peoples, Wayne wrote, I have always been of the opinion that we never should have a permanent peace with those Indians until they were made to experience our superiority. Throughout 1794, Wayne's army engaged in skirmishes with the Northwest Confederacy's forces. Chief Little Turtle of the Miami urged his allies to negotiate. In his view, Wayne's army looked overpowering, but Blue Jacket of the Shawnees counseled war and prevailed. The decisive battle came in August 1794 at Fallen Timbers, near the Maumee River southwest of Lake Erie. 800 warriors of the Northwest Confederacy ambushed the American forces without adequate weaponry. Unable to defeat the Americans, they withdrew and sought refuge at nearby Fort Miami, still held by the British. But the British commander locked the gate and refused protection. British forces stood by as their former allies were defeated and their ranks decimated. The defeat at Fallen Timbers marked the end of the Northwest Confederacy. It shattered the native coalition that had successfully resisted American encroachment into the Ohio Valley for over a decade and signaled the arrival of U.S. sovereignty in the Northwest. In 1795, about 1,000 Indians representing nearly a dozen nations met with Wayne and other American emissaries to negotiate the Treaty of Greenville. The Americans offered treaty goods, calico shirts, axes, knives, blankets, kettles, mirrors, ribbons, thimbles, and abundant wine and liquor casks worth $25,000 and promised annual shipments going forward. In exchange, the Indians ceded most of Ohio to the United States. Only the northwest part of the territory was reserved to the Indians. If the treaty brought temporary peace to the region, it generated new forms of discontent among many native peoples. The annual allowance from the United States too often came in the form of liquor. More of us have died since the Treaty of Greenville than we lost by the years of war before, and it is all owing to the introduction of liquor among us, said Chief Little Turtle in 1800. This liquor that they introduce into our country is more to be feared than the gun and tomahawk. Frustration about a decline of traditional Indian ways of life would help provoke renewed war in the following decade. In the meantime, however, U.S. settlement in the region would grow exponentially. If discontented settlers and war with Native Americans threatened the sovereignty of the United States on its western borders, epic events in the Atlantic world threatened the nation's very existence. In Europe, the outbreak of the French Revolution and renewed war between France and Great Britain pushed Americans to take sides. Desperate to avoid getting pulled into another war, the Washington and Adams administrations had to navigate bitter domestic and diplomatic divisions. Meanwhile, to the south, an unprecedented revolution of enslaved people in the Caribbean's most important colony raised racial fears and exposed the dangers of the nation's growing reliance on slave labor. In 1789, revolution broke out in France. To many Americans, it seemed as though the French, who had helped secure their independence, were now following their example. Americans up and down the coast organized celebrations and parades, sang French revolutionary songs, and proudly displayed French patriotic garb. Dozens of pro-French political clubs, called Democratic Republican Societies, sprang up around the country, many of them establishing correspondence with revolutionary clubs in France and avowing their solidarity with the French Republic. If most Americans celebrated the French Revolution in its early years, opinion began to divide in 1792 with its radicalization. After the French king was executed in January 1793 and Great Britain declared war on France, American popular opinion split sharply. Pro-French partisans, thrilled to see an absolutist monarchy overthrown and a sister republic emerge in the heart of Europe, enthusiastically threw their support behind the French cause. To them, the American and French revolutions were two branches of a single movement for worldwide republicanism. Meanwhile, those shaken by reports of the massacres of thousands of French aristocrats concluded that the French Revolution had spun out of control. They feared its effect on the United States and denounced the Democratic Republican societies as dangerous manifestations of popular unrest. To them, the American Revolution was distinct from the French, the former succeeding where the latter had failed. War between Britain and France meant war in the Caribbean, right on the United States' doorstep. Large sections of the U.S. economy, Shipbuilding, exports, finance, and more depended on trade with the lucrative Caribbean islands. Although the United States was bound by the 1778 Treaty of Amity and Commerce to support France, President Washington believed the country could not risk a renewed war with Great Britain. In May 1793, he issued the Neutrality Proclamation in an effort to stay out of the European war. Neutrality was more easily proclaimed than preserved. Taking advantage of its naval superiority, the British government issued a policy imposing a total blockade of France and its colonies, authorizing British vessels to stop and detain all ships trading with France or its islands. Before Americans had even learned of the policy, armed British privateers began seizing American ships, harassing their captains, impounding their cargoes, and forcing their sailors into service. In all, British forces detained more than 250 American ships. For all of Washington's efforts to keep the United States out of war, war seemed to be imposing itself upon him. In a desperate attempt to maintain peace, Washington sent John Jay, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, to negotiate a new treaty with Great Britain. Jay sailed off with ambitious instructions. He was to establish commercial relations in the British West Indies, secure compensation for the seized American ships, address Southerners' demands for reimbursement for the slaves who had left with the British during the American Revolution, and end the British occupation of frontier forts and their continuing support of the Northwest Confederacy in its war against the United States. Jay returned from his diplomatic mission with a humiliating agreement. The Jay Treaty accomplished only one of its objectives, the evacuation of frontier forts by the British. Meanwhile, the treaty failed to address the captured cargoes or the escaped slaves and did not recognize American neutrality. It called for repayment with interest of debts that American planters owed to British firms dating from the Revolutionary War, and it secured trading rights to British Caribbean islands on terms so limited that the Senate struck them out. Meanwhile, American shipping to the Caribbean would still be subject to seizure and American sailors still subject to harassment. With almost no concessions, British negotiators had secured the same commercial rights for their country as those granted to France. It looked to many Americans like a shameful capitulation to their former British monarchical enemy and a disgraceful betrayal of their French Republican ally. When newspapers published the terms of the treaty, public outrage erupted. Thousands of protesters gathered in Philadelphia and Charleston to burn copies of the treaty and throw stones at the houses of its most prominent supporters. Jay was burned in effigy in Boston, Philadelphia, and New York, and even as far west as Lexington, Kentucky. He joked that he could travel from one end of the seaboard to the other by the light of his burning effigies. "Damn John Jay," read some graffiti on the side of one New York building. For 6 weeks, hardly a day passed without some protest. When the Senate voted on the treaty, it passed by a vote of 20 to 10, the bare minimum of the two-thirds majority required. The year-long struggle over the Jay Treaty revealed the emerging role of public opinion in political debates, voiced by an aroused citizenry and often managed and shaped by newspaper editors and political clubs. It built on the Hamilton-Jefferson split over economic policy, further dividing Americans into two rival partisan camps. The boisterous republicanism emerging on the ground was looking very different from that imagined by the nation's founding fathers. In addition to wars on the Western Front and across the Atlantic, a growing conflict to the south raised bleaker fears about the nation's future. It took place in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, which had experienced extraordinary economic growth over the 18th century. By the time the French Revolution broke out in 1789, it was the richest, most productive colony of any European empire, exporting vast amounts of sugar, coffee, indigo, and cotton to markets in North America and Europe. All of it rested on the unstable foundation of slavery. Beginning in 1791, the colony exploded in a revolution that eventually led to the creation of the Republic of Haiti in 1804. The Haitian Revolution, like the French and American revolutions that preceded it, expressed radical ideas of liberty and equality. Unlike the other two, it extended that equality to people of African descent. Extreme social tensions preceded the revolution. At the top of the social order stood some 30,000 whites who dominated the colony. Alongside them were approximately 28,000 free people of African descent, gens de couleur, who owned 1/3 of the island's plantations and nearly 1/4 of the slave labor force. Despite their economic power, the gens de couleur had gradually been excluded from most sectors of the island's civil life over the previous 2 decades, including local political offices and militia service, and they were increasingly resentful. Finally, vastly outnumbering both groups were some 465,000 brutally oppressed slaves who produced the island's extravagant wealth. When the French Revolution broke out, white colonists divided between those supporting the French monarchy and others favoring reforms. Many took the opportunity to demand the elimination of imperial trade restrictions, pitting them against local authorities in France. The gens de couleur, meanwhile, saw the French Revolution's rhetoric of liberty and equality as an opportunity to abolish racist laws on the island. Whites were unwilling to give up their racial privileges, however, and before long, armed warfare broke out between the gens de couleur and recalcitrant whites. All of these tensions grew as hundreds of thousands of slaves groaned under some of the most brutal slavery the world had ever known. In August 1791, some 2,000 slaves in the island's rich northern plantations rose up, killing plantation owners and their families and setting fire to the immense fields of sugarcane. By September, roughly 50,000 slaves were in armed insurrection. The outbreak of war between France, Britain, and Spain in 1793 complicated the uprising, adding an imperial war to the existing divisions between royalists and republicans, whites and gens de couleur, free and slave. Led by former slave Toussaint Louverture, slaves and free blacks in alliance with Spain occupied the northern regions of the island. Desperate to retain their most important colony, French authorities on the island offered freedom to slaves willing to fight on their side. Thousands responded to the call. In June 1793, the colony's principal port, Cap Français, was burned to ruins. Thousands of white and mixed-race planters, along with some of their slaves, fled to Spanish Louisiana and port cities in the United States. In 1794, driven by events in Saint-Domingue, the French revolutionary government in Paris abolished slavery in all its colonies. 10 years later, after repelling both British and Spanish invasions and successfully resisting a brutal French attempt to restore slavery to the island, the former slaves proclaimed the creation of the Republic of Haiti. It was the first and only slave revolution to result in the creation of an independent nation. White Americans closely followed the revolution through newspapers and refugees' accounts. A few sympathized with the slave struggle for liberty, but many feared that violence might spread to the United States. Most condemned the violence, unwilling or unable to see the similarities between the American and Haitian revolutions, between whites in North America fighting for their freedom and slaves in the Caribbean fighting for theirs. Most black Americans, however, saw matters differently. They found inspiration in the epic revolution and the creation of the first black republic in the Americas. Among white Southerners, the Haitian Revolution provoked naked fears of slave insurrection. A tortured Jefferson wrote another Virginia slaveholder in 1797 that, "If something is not done, and soon done, about slavery in the United States, we shall be the murderers of our own children." New Englanders generally did not share Jefferson's cataclysmic fears. Massachusetts politician Timothy Pickering would later chastise Jefferson for supporting French revolutionaries while condemning black Haitians only because they had, quote, "a skin not colored like our own," end quote. Despite a broadly shared distrust of political parties, two rival political groups had emerged by Washington's second presidential term. After his retirement and the election of John Adams in 1796, party strife accelerated over failed diplomacy in France, bringing the United States to the brink of war. Pro-war and anti-war antagonism created a major crisis over political free speech, militarism, and fears of sedition and treason. During the 1790s, polarization over Hamilton's economic program, the French Revolution, and the Jay Treaty created two distinct political parties, Federalists and Democratic Republicans. Federalists supported Hamilton's economic program and sought closer diplomatic and economic ties with Britain. They condemned the excesses of the French Revolution and accused Democratic Republicans of imitating bloodthirsty French revolutionaries. Democratic Republicans, on the other hand, opposed Hamilton's economic program and sought closer ties with the French Republic. They continued supporting the revolution in France and accused Federalists of wanting to turn the United States into a monarchy. The fundamental difference between the Hamiltonian and Jeffersonian worldviews boils down to different views on democracy and what kind of democracy the United States should be, as well as what kind of nation the United States should be then and in the future. The Federalists were deeply elitist, highly distrustful of direct democracy, believing that most people are ignorant and impulsive, while the Democratic Republicans placed greater value and trust in ordinary people than in elites, believing that ordinary people possess what we call common sense enough to know what's good for their entire country is good for them individually. Wealthy elites, they charged, are more likely to be impulsive and inclined to support policies that benefit them alone instead of the nation as a whole. The Federalists saw the future of the United States as becoming a fully commercial and industrial nation like Great Britain, with agriculture playing a secondary supporting role in the national economy. They wanted New York City, Philadelphia, Boston, and other larger American cities to become like the great European cities of London, Paris, and Rome, which many looked to as great centers of culture and economic activity. The Democratic Republicans scorned urbanism in favor of ruralism, seeing the future of the United States as an agrarian nation in which low-scale cottage industry plays a secondary supporting role in the national economy. They despised large cities. Jefferson, having lived for some years in Paris while the ambassador to France, admitted that it was a center of culture and civilization, but that these benefits were far outweighed by the evils of overcrowding and corruption. Cities are places infested with poverty and crime where, as Jefferson sniffed, the people eat each other. The Federalists wanted to see the United States heavily involved in international trade and become a great diplomatic and military power in the world, the sooner the better, while the Democratic Republicans favored very limited international trade and an essentially isolationist foreign policy to avoid getting entangled in the many wars Europe flagrantly indulged in seemingly every decade. The United States, they argued, should keep to itself and had plenty of natural and human resources to be entirely self-sufficient and not depend on other nations. The Federalists urged a pro-British foreign policy, citing their deep historical ties and commonality of culture, while the Democratic Republicans favored a pro-French foreign policy in which a Democratic Republican United States would support France's Democratic Revolution then underway. The British, they insisted, could not be trusted and would jump at the first opportunity to conquer and recolonize its former possessions. The Federalists wanted to see the United States grow over time, quickly become as equal to Great Britain in as short a time as possible, while the Democratic Republicans wanted to see the United States grow over geographic space into the West to avoid its growing population from concentrating in the cities and making them larger. Which way should the infant nation go? Washington struggled to stay above party politics amidst the bitter division that raged around him, but the effort wore him down. In 1796, he decided to retire rather than seek a third term, announcing the decision in his farewell address, warning Americans in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of party. Washington stressed the importance of a unity of government. He warned against geographical discriminations, northern and southern, Atlantic and western, urging Americans to unite as an indissoluble community of interest as one nation. Finally, he cautioned his countrymen against a passionate attachment of one nation for another. He urged the nation to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. As a nationalist text that stressed the importance of political and geographic unity, the farewell address would go on to become one of the country's most important documents, recited at patriotic occasions like Washington's birthday or July 4th. As a nationalist text that stressed the importance of political and geographic unity, the farewell address would go on to become one of the country's most important documents, recited at patriotic occasions like Washington's birthday or July 4th. Upon Washington's retirement, Vice President John Adams of Massachusetts was elected the nation's second president, while his chief opponent, Thomas Jefferson, became vice president. Because the Constitution did not anticipate political parties, the top vote-getter became president and the next highest assumed the vice presidency. The 12th Amendment, adopted in 1804, changed that. Although his views mostly aligned with those of the Federalists, Adams too sought to govern above party. His inaugural speech pledged neutrality in foreign affairs and respect for the French people, which made Democratic Republicans hopeful. To please the Federalists, Adams retained 3 cabinet members from Washington's administration, the Secretaries of State, Treasury, and War. Adams was not an adept politician, however, and his prickly personality alienated potential allies. Nor could his ambition to govern without party allegiance survive the bitter quarrels of the 1790s. From the start, Adams's presidency was in crisis. France retaliated for the British-friendly Jay Treaty by abandoning its 1778 alliance with the United States. French privateers, armed private vessels, started detaining American ships carrying British goods. By March 1797, they had seized more than 300 American vessels. Federalists started speaking openly about war with France. Resisting Federalist pressure, Adams dispatched a 3-man commission to France in the fall of 1797 to negotiate a resolution. When the American commissioners arrived in Paris, French officials refused to receive them. Instead, the French Minister of Foreign Affairs sent 3 French agents, unnamed and later known to the American public as X, Y, and Z, to the American commissioners, informing them that a $250,000 bribe might grease the wheels of diplomacy. A $12 million loan to the French government, the agents added, would be the price of a peace treaty. Incensed, the commissioners brought news of the French demands to the president. Americans reacted to the XYZ affair with shock and anger. Even staunch pro-French Democratic Republicans began to reevaluate their allegiance. The Federalist-dominated Congress appropriated money for an army of 10,000 soldiers and repealed all prior treaties with France. In 1798, 20 naval warships launched the United States into its first undeclared war, called the Quasi War by historians to underscore its uncertain legal status. The main scene of action was the Caribbean, where French and American warships engaged each other in a back-and-forth struggle that cut off valuable West Indian trade. Antagonism between Federalists and Democratic Republicans intensified. Because the chance of a land invasion by France was vanishingly remote, some Democratic Republicans began to fear that Federalist demands for an enlarged army were intended to suppress domestic dissent. Partisanship grew to a frenzy. Democratic Republican newspapers denounced Adams as, quote, a person without patriotism, without philosophy, and a mock monarch, end quote. Pro-French mobs roamed the streets of Philadelphia, the capital. Adams, fearing for his safety, stocked weapons in his presidential quarters. Federalists, too, went on the offensive. In Newburyport, Massachusetts, they lit a huge bonfire and burned issues of the state's Democratic-Republican newspapers. Officers in a New York militia unit drank a toast on July 4, 1798, one and but one party in the United States. A Federalist editor ominously declared that he who is not for us is against us. With temper so high, out of a persistent belief that political dissent was equivalent to treason, Federalist leaders moved to silence the opposition. In mid-1798, Congress passed the Sedition Act, Section 1 of which reads in part, if any persons shall unlawfully combine or conspire together with intent to oppose any measure or measures of the government of the United States, if any person or persons with intent as aforesaid shall counsel, advise, or attempt to procure any insurrection, riot, or unlawful assembly, he or they shall be deemed guilty of a high misdemeanor, and on conviction shall be punished by a fine not exceeding $5,000, and by imprisonment during a term not less than 6 months, nor exceeding 5 years. Section 2 reads in part, if any person shall write, print, utter, or publish, or shall cause or procure to be written, printed, uttered, or published, or shall knowingly and willingly assist or aid in writing, printing, uttering, or publishing any false, scandalous, and malicious writing or writings against the government of the United States, or either House of the Congress of the United States, or the President of the United States, with intent to defame the said government, then such person, being thereof convicted, shall be punished by a fine not exceeding $2,000 and by imprisonment not exceeding 2 years. As is abundantly clear, the Sedition Act is a blatant violation of the First Amendment, but it achieved an important Federalist goal. In all, 25 men, almost all Democratic Republican newspaper editors, were charged with sedition. 12 were convicted. Congress also passed two Alien Acts. The first extended the period for an immigrant to acquire citizenship to 14 years from 5, and required all foreigners to register with the federal government. The second empowered the president in time of war to deport or imprison without trial any foreigner suspected of being a danger to the United States. Democratic Republicans strongly opposed the Alien and Sedition Acts, but did not have the votes to block them in Congress, nor could they count on the federal judiciary, dominated by Federalist judges, to challenge laws that conflicted with the Bill of Rights. Jefferson and Madison therefore turned to the state legislatures to press their opposition. Each man anonymously drafted a set of resolutions condemning the acts and convinced the legislatures of Virginia and Kentucky to present them to the federal government. The 1798 Virginia and Kentucky resolutions argued that state legislatures have the right to nullify federal laws that violate the Constitution. Although the resolutions made little dent in the Alien and Sedition Acts, the idea that a state could nullify federal law did not disappear. It would resurface several times in decades to come, most notably in a major tariff dispute in 1832 and in the sectional arguments that led to the Civil War. Amid the war hysteria and sedition fears of 1798, President Adams regained his balance. He showed uncharacteristic restraint in pursuing opponents under the Sedition Act. Most significantly, he refused to declare war on France. He shrewdly realized that France, still embroiled in ferocious warfare with Great Britain, did not want a war with the United States and that a peaceful settlement might be possible. In January 1799, French authorities signaled that diplomatic channels were open and that new peace commissioners would be welcomed. Adams appointed new negotiators. By late 1799, the Quasi War with France had subsided, and in 1800, diplomatics agreed on a treaty declaring a true and sincere friendship between the United States and France. American political leaders launched the new government in 1789, hoping to unify the country and overcome factionalism. The great public reservoir of trust in President Washington was the central foundation for these hopes, and Washington did not disappoint. He became a model Mr. President, with a blend of integrity and authority. The easy passage of the Bill of Rights, to appease anti-federalists, further added to the stability, as did attention to cultivating a citizenry of virtuous men supported by Republican womanhood. Yet the optimism of that honeymoon period soon turned to worry and then fear as major political disagreements blazed. On the domestic front, the principal source of political conflict concerned economic policy. Hamilton's economic program rested on a vision of the future that much of the country opposed. Hamilton and his allies wanted a powerful federal government overseeing a robust financial system and the development of manufacturing. Jefferson, Madison, and their allies hoped for a nation of small landowning farmers trading peacefully with the rest of the world. These disagreements about political economy might not have led to such bitter partisanship had the international context been more peaceful, but it was not. The Constitution's first decade took place in the face of American Indian determination to maintain their lands, bitter violence on the nation's western front, and on the Atlantic Ocean, some of the most intense warfare the world had ever experienced. The United States could not avoid being dragged into these conflicts. As the radical ideas articulated in the American Revolution echoed across the Atlantic and in the Caribbean, questions about the connected fates of liberty, equality, race, and republicanism pressed insistently on the nation's emerging institutions.